Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, 6 Ways to Increase Hybrid Active Directory Security. Today, we have two industry experts here with us, and they're going to be discussing the current challenges of Active Directory and strategies to secure it in today's ever-changing landscape. I'm McKenna. I work alongside the tech experts here at KOSoft. Just a couple housekeeping items to go over before we jump into the presentation. First off, you'll notice your microphones are muted to make sure everybody has the optimal listening experience. So we do encourage you to ask any questions that you have. So depending on how you join today, either in browser or through the app, you'll see a question or chat section on your screen. Feel free to drop your questions there, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end of the presentation or throughout if we see them. If we run short on time today, we will reach out to you directly after the presentation to follow up. This session will also be recorded, and we'll email you a link in the days following to share with your team. At the end of the presentation, we'll also share contact info for both our speakers. If you have any additional questions or you're watching this on demand, feel free to reach out to us. I'd like to take a quick moment to introduce our speakers today. First, we have Brian Desmond. Brian is a principal at Ravenswood Technology Group. At Ravenswood, Brian helps commercial enterprise and higher education customers solve problems surrounding enterprise mobility, Active Directory, identity management, and Office 365. Brian was recognized annually as Microsoft MVP for identity and access management for 15 years for his contributions to the Microsoft technical community at large. Brian is also the author of Active Directory 5th Edition, published by O'Reilly, as well as a frequent contributor to leading industry publications. You can often find Brian speaking at conferences and events like this worldwide. Next, we have Robert Boble. Bob is the founder and CEO of KOSoft. With more than 25 years of leadership in the technology industry, Bob has developed a deep understanding of Active Directory identity and access space, and has been a contributing voice in the evolution of the hybrid Microsoft enterprise. Prior to KOSoft, Bob has held several executive management positions with companies like Quest Software and Netrix, driving strategy and product innovation for Microsoft platform management and administration. He's also served as a subject matter expert for Microsoft and was actually one of the first individuals in the world to be certified on the Microsoft then new Windows Server platform. As you can see, these two gentlemen have a great amount of knowledge to share. So on that note, I'll pass it over to Bob.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that. I appreciate the intro. So let's discuss briefly why we're here, why we're talking about trying to secure on-premise Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, and the connection between the two, which we call hybrid. Well, it's because there are more and more people trying to take out your Active Directory and trying to breach your corporate data. And those breaches and those outages are extremely expensive. And so it's up to us as IT folks worried about protecting our organization's information to prevent this stuff. So there's a great report from Verizon on data breaches. They do this every year, and it gives you an insight into what is going on in the industry. And what they're saying is an increase in insider threats and a malicious activity. So those are folks in your organization granted some level of permission that are performing tasks or performing actions they likely shouldn't be doing, or you have exposed accounts through vendors that are being used to manipulate your environment. They're seeing an increase in Active Directory attacks or attacks where Active Directory is the entry point. They're seeing not only more data breaches, but they're also seeing a lot more ransomware attacks. And what's interesting is as they're looking across all of the reports that they have, they do kind of an interesting double check. They validate for all the incidents that are reported to them or that they discover, they validate that they can prove that it was some sort of data breach. And on the right-hand side, what you'll see is a little chart there. It's 4.8%, 12%, and 18% over the last 3 years. So definitely an increase. And that increase is the percentage of verified data breaches out of all those that they're considering. So you'll definitely see a jump, particularly in 2019 and in 2020. And I expect, and I think their authors expect as well, that that'll continue to increase. And one of the things that they're seeing is an increase in the sophistication of the attacks. So a lot of lateral attacks, attacks where they compromise an account and they move laterally. A lot more ransomware attacks that are taking out they're encrypting your domain controllers or your file servers. So you have to really kind of keep an eye on that. And again, the whole point is that you can lose that data to people. They'll steal it, your intellectual property, or it can shut your business down. And there's an estimate that they came up with, that they mentioned from IBM, that the cost for any sort of data breach or ransomware incident is on average 3.86 million for enterprises. That's for enterprises, not for small companies. So keep that in mind. But that's quite a bit of money. And I've seen recent, within the last 2 years, numbers from Gartner Consulting for the outages of Active Directory that something like a ransomware attack might cause. And those outages cost something like $5,000 a minute, or almost $6,000 per minute. So those are quite expensive when they happen, and that's just from lost productivity and downtime. These data breaches are from not just lost productivity and downtime, but also from the loss of intellectual property, et cetera. So it includes a much broader scope. And you can imagine somebody like a national retailer, if their Active Directory gets taken down, how much money it would cost them if it took them weeks to bring that back. So one of the other things that's making securing Active Directory more difficult is this move to cloud. All right. So we wanted to understand better what was going on across the industry with the move to adopt cloud. How many people had gone cloud only? Was there a particular size of organization that went cloud only? And what we could expect for the people in hybrid. Now, the results were a little surprising to me. The first thing I'll point out to you, or I'll draw your attention to, are the percentages. We've organized these by percentage, not by necessarily what we think is the most logical order on the left-hand side. But what was interesting to me is that 2% of the respondents from this Pulse research that we contracted to have Pulse do was that 2% of these folks are moving away from Microsoft completely. We're likely going to Google, is our estimate, although the study didn't ask that. There are several that are moving to cloud only within the next 3 to 5 years, so they're not quite ready. They're probably in hybrid, but they're planning on, so 7% are planning on going to hybrid. 17% came back and said that they were cloud only. Now, this research included some folks that were mid-market, which are smaller companies, anywhere between 500 users and 5,000 users. I suspect it was within those ranges that we saw cloud-only organizations, but 17% of them, right? That's, rounding up, that's 20%. That's a big deal that those organizations went cloud-only. And then we had another group that was moving to cloud-only within 1 to 2 years. And when you total all that up, it's about roughly 45% are planning on going cloud only. And then you had 2% that were planning on being on-premise forever. They just don't need cloud. And then the very last one, the orange one, is that 54% said that they were going to remain in hybrid mode. And their choice of hybrid mode was Active Directory on-premise using Azure Active Directory Connect to synchronize users, group memberships from on-premise to cloud, and then also using the authentication mechanisms provided on one side or the other to start using modern authentication. So some of the conclusions that we came out with, since not everybody is cloud only, right? The ones that we're looking at here, only 17% were cloud only. That means, 25% or 23%, whatever the number comes out to be, are still in hybrid mode. But AD is definitely in hybrid mode for the majority of organizations, anywhere 500 up to 1 million employees, whatever the larger enterprises are. So hybrid AD is the de facto standard. So get used to it. I'm guessing most of you are in that mode. And then we started to think about why people aren't moving faster to the cloud. And our conclusion is that Azure Active Directory is, first of all, it's new to people. So there's some questions there around what it does. And so there's a lot more education that's going to happen. But Azure Active Directory doesn't completely replace Active Directory on-premise. We call it legacy AD here, but it just doesn't have exactly the same feature sets and provide the same level of service. It actually has more in some areas and less in some others. It's a little bit more difficult. I think people fear losing that control because they're now handing the day-to-day maintenance of the directory to somebody else, to the Microsoft employees. Transitioning to cloud only can be very complex and challenging because there's a lot of resources that you've spent 20 years integrating into legacy Active Directory, and you might not be able to pull those together and move them to cloud overnight, right? So if you have door badges, right? So I've seen lots of systems where you scan the door badge on the conference room or in the main entry of your building, and that actually authenticates against Active Directory. So there's baggage that can't be easily moved. That's another reason why people haven't transitioned. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is just because we're calling out hybrid, that doesn't mean that there isn't some cloud-only aspect to these environments. For example, if you're using Microsoft Teams, each team is based on an Azure unified group. They're also, I think, called Office 365 groups, or now Microsoft 365 groups, but they do not have an equivalent on-premise, right? It's a new group type that acts as a DL, as a team basis, has a bunch of other things that it integrates into. And if you're using Teams and you're a hybrid organization, you have a cloud-only object there with that team that you're going to have to maintain. And so it's important to understand that you actually now have two environments to worry about in these cases, not just one environment, the on-premise side of the directory. You now have to worry about the Azure side of the directory. So managing not just the hybrid objects that are being synchronized up, but then also managing a bunch of brand new objects and object types that are in the cloud only. So Brian, any comments on this from you on what you think is maybe some reasons people are having a hard time understanding where to apply their resources to try and secure things?
Yeah, I mean, certainly as folks have moved into that hybrid state, it's stretched already thin resources, and many organizations that we work with, of course, the top thing is that there just aren't enough people to do all the work that's happening. And of course, there's a lot of focus, especially from a marketplace perspective, on investment in the cloud, but that doesn't necessarily remove the need to continue to invest in the traditional on-premises infrastructure that most organizations have built up over decades and decades. But when it's not getting the attention that it should, that often leads to opportunities for bad things to happen. And certainly we've heard a lot about that in the news lately, as various
Right.
organizations have had different compromises and breaches and so forth. And because of that, it's super important to continue investing in some of that on-premises footprint, and even more so if it hasn't really been apparent yet. I think it's becoming very apparent now that investment that maybe wasn't planned from a security perspective has to bubble to the top.
Thanks for those great comments, Brian. Appreciate it. So let's go ahead and move on. And I'm going to turn it over to Brian to walk us through his first way to help secure Active Directory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the theme for all these is really around preventing two things. One is this concept of lateral movement, which is the ability for someone that compromises one machine or one computer within an organization to be able to hop to another, whether that's another client computer, an end user machine, or if someone compromises a member server, being able to hop to another server and so forth. Being able to prevent that concept of lateral movement makes it a lot harder for an adversary. And then the second thing is that we also want to be able to prevent this concept of privilege escalation. And by doing that, we make it harder for the adversary both to move from machine to machine. And then of course, the thing that they typically want to do as you move from machine to machine is figure out how to elevate your access. Today, you just have privileged access on one server or one computer. How do you gain privileged access over a whole set of them or even over the whole environment? So putting controls in place to prevent both of those things makes life a lot harder for the bad guy, and of course, things potentially a lot better for you. Of course, it doesn't prevent something from happening, but it certainly makes it harder. So from a lateral movement prevention, one of the things that we always want to see our customers do and that we work really hard to make sure they do is having the local administrator account, the local administrator password on every single machine. It needs to be different, because if I can compromise one machine and it has the same local administrative credentials as another, I can hop from one to the next. The good news is Microsoft makes a solution available that's free that does this. It does it really well. It's something called the local admin password solution. Most people know it as LAPS. It's a really small package that gets deployed onto endpoints, and then it starts randomizing that local administrator password. It escrows that password in Active Directory as a property of the computer account, so you can make sure that the right people in IT, whether that's your end user support team, a help desk, et cetera, can retrieve that. And on a regular basis, it rotates that password so that it's always changing. Now what happens is, because those passwords are different on each machine, it makes it harder to hop from one machine to the next. Those aren't the only things that you need to do. There's also things like making sure that you don't have large groups of domain users, or really any domain user nested in the local administrators group, whether it's on computers or servers, because if I can compromise those accounts, I can use them to hop from one machine to the next as well. So those are a couple of things that make it a lot harder for someone to move laterally, which is a really important defense to have in your organization.
So Brian, we have a quick question here. How do attackers gain access to the first machine? I know that there's a lot of different ways, Brian, and maybe just give us one or two.
Yeah, certainly there's a lot of different ways, but typically they're through whether malware makes it onto a machine, or especially when we think about it in the context of servers, there's an unpatched vulnerability that provides an ability for someone to execute code and establish a presence there. But fundamentally, it's how to get some level of privileged access on that machine, and then establish a foothold.
Yeah, so once they're on the machine, then it's the attacker's job to figure out which way they're going to compromise that machine to move laterally, whether it's grabbing passwords or whatever. Pretty cool.
Yeah,
Okay, thanks, Brian.
yeah, absolutely.
All right.
The next one's more about privilege escalation, and many of you have probably heard there's this concept of this tiered security model that Microsoft has advertised for years now, and even more so, they've recently adjusted some of the guidance around that. Some of that adjusted guidance is certainly there to accommodate how things have evolved from just looking at this in the concept of an on-premises footprint to also looking at this in the context of a hybrid environment. But regardless, the idea here is that we want to segregate different assets that are joined to the domain in terms of, you might think of it as either levels of impact or levels of assurance about the security of that. And historically in that model, there's three tiers. Tier 0 is anything that can, if I can gain control of that, I can gain complete control of the entire IT environment. And of course, Active Directory is a really good example of that. If I can get control of AD, I can get control of anything that's joined to the domain. Other things that usually fall into that tier are things like other identity systems, whether that's a provisioning system like a SailPoint, or a federation tool like an ADFS or a Ping Federate, PKI is another one, and so forth. The middle tier is all of our member servers, where all our applications are, all our data is. And then finally, tier 2, which is our lowest level of assurance, is end user computing devices, PCs, laptops, and so forth. And as we think about each of those tiers and think about them at different levels of assurance in terms of what's our risk that they are compromised, and more importantly, what do we want to make sure doesn't touch one of those machines if they are compromised? You know, starting from the top, the last thing we ever want is to see a tier 0 account, which would be a domain admin, for example, to touch anything in a lower tier, because we assume those lower tiers are compromised. So if a server in tier 1 is compromised, or an end user device in tier 2 is compromised, and we have a highly privileged account like a domain admin touch it, it gives that attacker the ability to capture those credentials and escalate their privileges. And at that point, of course, it makes it much easier for the attacker. If they can actually capture a tier 0 credential, a domain admin credential, that's typically game over. They've made their way into really anything that they want. So of course, the question is, how do we do this? There's a bunch of different pieces to this, and some are a little easier than others. But fundamentally, there's a couple of things. One, we want to segregate administrative accounts, both so that they're separate admin accounts, which has been a best practice for a really long time. We also want to separate them by tiers. So of course, hypothetically, that might mean that you could have a single person in IT could have multiple administrator accounts, maybe even 3 in this model, 1 for each tier. And then we want to put controls in place, typically using something like group policy or another feature of AD called authentication policy silos, to make sure that the different tiered accounts don't touch lower tiers. So we never want to have a scenario where that tier 0 account can log on to anything in tier 1 or tier 2. Likewise, we don't want anything in tier 1 to be able to log on to tier 2. The other way is okay. We wouldn't want to have a tier 2 admin account be granted access to tier 1, because we assume it might be compromised, but it is okay for resources to be accessed from a lower tier to a higher tier. But the vice versa, where we have privileged accounts, those have to stay within their tiers. Once this is put in place, it makes it a lot harder to escalate privileges, even if someone's able to move laterally within a tier. The third thing around tiering that's really important, and this is one that's often hidden and often can be really hard to solve, is this concept of equivalencies within a tier, where the classic example is you might have a management tool like an endpoint management tool or a SIM system, something like that. That of course has a management console. Typically, most of these systems also use agents. When those agents are installed on a server, or in the context of AD on a domain controller, they often have a substantial amount of access. They run as local system, they run as network service. That gives the agent, the tool, the ability to do what it needs to do, but it also has implicit access to do lots of other things. Anything that runs as local system, runs as network service on a domain controller, for example, essentially has unfettered access to all of AD, because it's running in the context of the domain controller. The domain controller's access to AD, which implicitly is virtually everything. What we see in many compromise scenarios is that someone's able to compromise a management system, maybe an endpoint management tool that's also installed on all your domain controllers. That management system ordinarily runs in a lower tier. We think of it as a server or even a desktop management tool. But because it has access to AD, someone that compromises it can often use it to run code. Maybe they can deploy a script, an executable, something like that. Because it's running as local system, it's running as network service on a domain controller, it can do anything they want to AD. That could be extracting password hashes, adding an account to domain admins, all sorts of other things. So of course the question is, what do we do about this? And this can be tough to solve, but fundamentally those tools, those agents have to be removed from the domain controllers if they have the ability to do these things. Now, of course, your question is, well, it's serving an important purpose. I'm using it for patching. I'm using it for log collection. I can't stop doing that. So now the thing that you have to decide is, well, do I stand up another instance of this tool that we run out of tier 0 that's probably has to be run by the same team that runs AD, just from an insurance perspective? Do I look for an alternative, maybe a cloud-based tool, or just how do I replace this? And depending on how many of these agents, how many of these tools there are, that list can get really long. But if you don't solve this, it becomes a really easy avenue of compromise, and something that we've seen in a lot of different situations.
Awesome, Brian. Thanks so much for that. It's a little scary, the number of compromises we've seen recently where this has been the architecture of the attack. Pretty interesting. All right, so I'm going to broaden this out a little bit and talk a little bit about some strategies you can employ to also assist in protecting Active Directory, whether that's on-premise or cloud. One of the important things to realize is that, you know, as you apply those strategies that Brian has mentioned, you still are going to have some fundamental need to trust administrators, right? So you're going to have these folks that are going to be making changes to your content in Active Directory, your users, groups, adding machines, et cetera. The things that allow Active Directory on-premise to do its work, and the things that allow Azure Active Directory to be used to do its thing, to authenticate users, and then provide a mechanism for granting access across your environment. And you're going to have to do that by granting permissions, right? And so you may find that your use of native tools puts you directly into trying to delegate those tasks out. And you may find that, especially with on-premise Active Directory, that you may have to get down to a very, very granular level of assigning security. And in some cases, you'll find that the granularity just isn't there. There may be, for example, groups of permissions that are granted across multiple things in the interface. It turns out it may be a single attribute that you're providing permissions over, but it might control, you know, a half dozen settings on a user account, for example. So the granularity won't be there in some cases that may be necessary to really implement what we like to call least, what is known in the industry as a least privileged delegation model, right? That means to give the bare minimum permissions to a user to perform the tasks or the job that they've been given to do. And so, you know, starting off with not having granular security, the ability to delegate granularly enough makes it difficult to do this. So you're going to have to make a couple trade-offs if you're using native permissions to allow people to get their jobs done. And that's where a little bit of trust comes in, right? So there are other ways that you can try and mitigate those things, but in some cases, the native implementations just aren't enough. So some of the issues you're going to have to be concerned with about native delegation is that the granularity is not enough. Unfortunately, delegation in Active Directory is really designed around controlling the tasks that can be executed, but that doesn't necessarily control how those tasks are executed. All right, and so that means that you know, you can grant somebody the ability to update something simple like a phone number. You can give permissions over that, but you can't control the format they put it in. Right, so if you're trying to do simple things like put a phone number format in that's going to be recognized properly by Teams or by Exchange, that's not part of the native delegation process, right? So you'll have to come up with other mechanisms to do that. And Brian mentioned, for example, SailPoint, which is a provisioning system. Those tools have extra controls around delegation of day-to-day administration, may help you with things like least privilege delegation. Chaosoft has one as well. But the idea is that you want to be able to control both at a very granular level the tasks that people can complete. So if they only need to reset passwords, only let them reset passwords. And then also control how they perform those tasks, right? So In that case, it's not just about controlling data. For example, if you're going to assign an account, maybe you want a specific convention used for that user account. And so those are things that you're going to have to grapple with, because native permission and native delegations just don't provide. Microsoft does provide some additional functionality in Azure Active Directory. They still don't provide control over how tasks are performed, but they have introduced roles to allow you to understand better what permissions people are granted. It's a little different from the on-premise grants, which are typically done either directly in ACLs or through a group membership that you've granted the permissions to the group, and then you put the delegated administrator, the trustee, in that group. And in some cases, those roles still aren't granular enough, but they do now provide custom roles. And so you can tailor those to almost anything you need, again, to delegate the ability to execute tasks, not necessarily control how they're executed. And then finally, anytime you can use time-limited memberships or time-limited permission sets to control privileged users or groups, which are these day-to-day admins would fall in that category, you want to use those if possible, so that they're only granted the permissions they need to perform tasks while they need to perform the task, right? And so that may be an approval process where they request it and it's approved and it's granted, or maybe just simply they have their normal user account and its escalation to perform those tasks is granted on an ad hoc basis through some process that may not even require an approval. But the idea is that those administrators won't be carrying around those permissions on their account. So if that account's compromised, then hopefully whatever process they use to escalate the privilege just in time will prevent those attackers from being able to go off and perform tasks that you don't want them to perform with a full-time privileged account versus a privileged account that only gets the privileges when needed. Third-party tools are an option. Agents, be careful with, as Brian was talking about. One thing I wanted to mention, Chaosoft does a lot of work in this area, and being able to provide native security around any kind of proxy account or service account for a SailPoint or a Chaosoft or whatever gives you some of that control that you may be looking for to ensure that if that account were to be compromised, it's not going to be used to take out the entire directory. So keep that in mind. Those are important things to look for third-party tools. But also, there's a lot of care and feeding that is going to go along with those things. You're going to have another system that you have to look at, it's really up to you to weigh the pros and the cons for those types of things, whether that extra effort you have to put in is really improving security and also saving you time in your situation.
Yeah, and another thing we see there quite a bit, Bob, especially when we look at AD from like a health check perspective and delegation, is people continue to use the built-in operators groups that came around, been there since Windows NT, and they've come forward. And while it makes it really easy to put someone in a group like account operators and they can manage users and groups and so forth, it also gives them a ton of extra access to AD that nobody knows about. For example, print operators sounds like, oh great, I can manage printers, but it turns out it also lets you install drivers on domain controllers and even lets you restart them as well, which are is a clear risk and also something that nobody realizes. So it creates another vulnerability just in the name of kind of the easy button for granting access.
Yeah, and the third-party tools situation does eliminate some of that if it's deployed properly, right? With those cautions that we've pointed out over the last couple of slides. That's one of the big benefits there, that you can likely grant specific abilities for tasks to be performed by an individual through a role-based access control model, but they may not have actual native permissions. The service account itself acts as sort of the traffic cop or the proxy works as a traffic cop, just the same way a firewall would, right? To figure out whether a particular change request is serviced or not, or allowed through to the directory. So the next one is something that is surprising to me that everybody isn't already doing this, but I think it's important, and that is to keep an eye open for changes that are being made, right? So you can do your best to configure your environment to slow down attackers or prevent specific attacks, but things are changing on a daily basis, and there's always something new lurking around the corner that we may not be aware of. And there are two things that I think people sort of they don't quite get, and that is, logging might not be enough. So just relying on the native event logs, either in AD or Azure AD, may not be enough for several reasons. First of all, one of the steps in a kill chain is for the attacker to go back and cover their tracks, which is likely going to be them tampering with the ability for the systems to either generate logs, disabling logs, etc. In Azure Active Directory and in on-premise Active Directory, there are specific changes that may not be logged at all to begin with. And the only way you can really find out if those types of changes are being made are through direct observation. So you actually have to poll the system to see, what's the current state. So some of those things, you can't get through logging, and then logs are often, one of those steps in potential attack to compromise the logging, so that they blind your SIEM tool or your event log monitoring tool to the fact that those changes are happening. So find yourself a good monitoring solution. I suggest that because Active Directory on-premise in a hybrid scenario is being synchronized to the cloud, if on-premise directory is compromised, likely the accounts in the cloud are compromised, which means the data breach could extend not just your on-premise systems, but also into the cloud to whatever assets or resources are there. So the idea is to continuously sort of monitor the directory, as many aspects as you can of the directory, to figure out exactly what's being changed in the directory. That could be a group policy on the on-premise side, could be a conditional access policy in Azure AD, could be admin SD holder object, which carries permissions that are pushed throughout Active Directory, could be the Azure user access role through a self-escalation. All those types of things are potentially out there, and there are a lot of solutions here that do this now. It's not just one or two companies. There are quite a few companies out there doing this sort of thing, and most of those solutions out there will also correlate with event logs. So as it's detecting a change, it will scan event logs and try and correlate the change that was detected with what's in the event log, so that if there's additional data that can be used to learn about what was actually going on with a particular change, you've not only isolated the change, but now you may have additional information should the log be available. Obviously, you're going to want to use that to notify or alert people that specific changes were made. It could be something as simple as, hey, the CEO's account has just had its password reset. Or it could be more sophisticated, like, hey, the global admin role in Office or enterprise admins has a new member in it. Doesn't take a lot to do those things, but those are things that you might want to communicate across your security team, so that everybody understands what's actually going on. Some of those items are listed down here at the bottom of our slide here, just talking about what objects or what items are pretty critical to monitor. And this is not a complete list by any means. This is just some of the things that you want to keep an eye on. And there are a lot of settings in particular in Active Directory. Brian was talking about using laps. Well, you have to enable that. That's great, no problem. If it's not enabled, it'd be nice if something told you it's not enabled, right? So anytime you can use one of the solutions out there that also provide suggestions on security, or you can find good folks like Brian, who can help you analyze your environment and figure out exactly where you're deficient and where you need to maybe implement solutions to increase your security posture. So finally, our sixth item I have is to prepare for an immediate recovery. So things are going to happen, right? I think Brian alluded to this earlier, that slowing down may be an actual strategy, slowing down somebody who's making malicious changes in your environment. But the key is they might be making malicious changes in your environment. And even more likely than that, in some cases, just on a day-to-day basis, would just be simple mistakes that people make that might compromise your environment or cause an outage, right? So the ultimate goal for a lot of attackers is to tie up your environment so it can't be used, and then they extort you, or they want to steal information, right? So being able to recover from those malicious or mistakes, malicious changes or mistakes, is pretty important. And if those are causing outages, that means your business is no longer running. So if Active Directory is down, people are not logging in, they're not getting access to their documents, they're not able to swipe their door badges, they might not be able to print. There's all sorts of ramifications there. And so that's why these outages become so expensive. It can be just expensive because one particular user in your accounting department had their account accidentally deleted. Could be a lot more expensive if they've corrupted your directory or locked up the servers that your directory is running on, right? Encrypted them so that you have to pay a ransom in order to get your data back. But whatever that compromise is, or whatever that mistake is that shuts you down, is going to be expensive. And so recovering from that quickly is one strategy to reduce the cost in terms of user downtime and physical cost, because you might not be selling your products or whatever during that time period. So a forest recovery is one strategy to remediate some of those larger cyber attacks. If a recovery can be performed without reintroducing the compromises that allowed the attack to happen in the first place, so keep that in mind. There are a couple of great forest recovery tools out on the market. That's sort of one thing that we see people using to mitigate that particular issue. Unwanted changes are going to happen. Take that as just sort of a fact of life and prepare for it. A couple things that people sometimes don't get. You'll hear the term recycle bin for on-premise Active Directory. You might hear the term recycle bin in the cloud. Those are really just undeletes, right? So if something accidentally gets deleted, which actually doesn't happen that frequently anymore, but they'll actually allow you to recover those objects, just bring them back to a non-deleted state. On premise, it's pretty much most objects in Active Directory, with some exceptions around like Exchange distribution lists and things like that. In the cloud, Azure Active Directory is just users and groups. If a deletion is done and it skips the recycle bin, you can't get those objects back. You have to recreate them. So that hard deletes don't really get covered. More likely, you have somebody who's emptied the membership of a group, or made a change to a conditional access policy or a group policy that has caused an issue. That's really most likely. And so obviously object and attribute recovery are pretty important still today. You may have a hardware failure and lose a domain controller. You might want to be able to bring those back. And there are several scenarios where restoring Active Directory DCs might be valuable to you. And then we already mentioned forest recovery, which is, hey, I've lost my directory either because of a corruption or a compromise. We don't see a lot of corruptions happening, but we definitely see a lot of compromises happening that will take out the directory. And so be prepared for that, especially if you can't be, if you're going to go out of business because your directory fails, you definitely want to be looking at that. And then finally, keep in mind that obviously Microsoft's not backing up or going to be able to recover your on-premise directory. And they're not really going to be able to recover your Azure Active Directory. They're not responsible for backing up your AD on-premise or in the cloud, and they're not really responsible for backing up your data also. So consider your options there pretty seriously and look to see if there isn't something that will allow you to make sure that you're covered in case of those compromises or mistakes that might take your directory out, which would eliminate the ability to access the information that's being stored on file systems, on in the cloud and OneDrive and SharePoint, etc. I do have one more slide here that I wanted to mention. Brian mentioned this local admin password solution. Highly recommended. Here's just a couple bullet points on some of the things that it helps with, but there's a nice screenshot of the small package that you can deploy to an administrator to let them retrieve that password or set the password expiration, et cetera, for those local administrator passwords. In our solution, we actually thought this was such a cool thing to do that we extended it with a web version, and this is free. It's a free part of our offerings. You just have to install our solution, and off to the races you go. And this allows you then to access those passwords when needed through role-based delegation and through a web portal, so that you don't necessarily have to install that LAPS app on your local machine. So just two quick things. This is how we pay the bills. Two quick sort of updates on Chaosoft and what we do, and then we'll turn it over to Brian and let him chat about Ravenswood a little bit and some of the things they do. The folks here at Chaosoft, I am blessed to work with. We have probably a couple hundred years combined experience in building management solutions for Microsoft on-premise directory. A lot of our experience came from wrapping identity management around Active Directory and building a Active Directory centric identity platform, which translated very nicely when we went to cloud. I think we're known as having innovative solutions. I think we're the only solution out there that's true hybrid, meaning it lets you manage all your on-premise identities and groups, et cetera, simultaneously in the same interface as managing all of your cloud-based assets as well in terms of Active Directory. We also provide change monitoring, and we do provide object and attribute recovery in our single solution for both on-premise and cloud. So it kind of makes it a simple choice to deploy, and we're pretty flexible on the way we deal with customers, and I think that's reflected in our I think it's a 5-year or 3-year year-over-year 98% retention of customers. So once customers join our family, they are pretty happy with us and they continue with us. So and our focus is really Active Directory. We do have some capability around things like Google for provisioning, et cetera, but really it's about Microsoft's directories, both on-premise and cloud. Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you to tell us a little bit about what you guys do at Ravenswood.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a consulting organization, and we really focus on the Microsoft security, identity, and compliance stack. We've got a team of people across the US and Canada that's really all they do on a day-to-day basis, and enables us to be super deep around many of the topics that we talked about today, as well as the other components of that stack. And so to us, that of course means Active Directory. We do a ton of work around hardening, post-incident recovery, as well as things like cleanup projects, merger and acquisitions. From a hardening perspective, the tiered model that we talk about, privileged access workstations, admin forests, some people call those red forests, amongst other things, are all things that we do day in and day out with primarily mid-market and enterprise customers. And then on the kind of the hybrid and the cloud side of things, it's really the security, identity, and compliance parts of the Microsoft 365 stack. So Azure Active Directory, Intune, Microsoft Information Protection, the various defenders for endpoint, as well as Office, and of course identity, which is something we didn't really talk about today, but is definitely a tool that we recommend to customers to have more insight to potential lateral movement and privilege escalation within AD, and then some of the compliance products in Office 365 as well, around things like data governance and data loss prevention and so forth. And those components really make up what we do, and things that we think we do really well with our customers.
Yeah, I want to point out down at the bottom of the slide, there's the website ravenswoodtechnology.com. If you want to get a hold of Brian or myself, we've put up the contact information. There's our email address, so if you have questions or if you want additional information about solutions or services, please contact us. We really appreciate it. With that, I'm going to turn it over to McKenna to close this up.
Thanks, Bob. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. That concludes our presentation today. As Bob said, if anyone has additional questions, feel free to reach out to either Bob or Brian with the contact information on the screen. Again, feel free to check out ravenswoodtechnology.com or kosoft.com to see more about our services. Thank you so much for your time and have a great day.